Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world where the walls of a royal palace could hide more fear than a battlefield, where velvet curtains concealed whispered conspiracies, where magnificent crowns rested upon heads burdened by suspicion, obsession, and impossible expectations. Tonight, we explore some of the most disturbing royal families in history, not because they fought great wars or built glorious empires, but because behind their glittering courts lay stories of betrayal, cruelty, paranoia, family feuds, strange traditions, and tragedies that unfolded generation after generation. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy slow historical journeys like this one. And now, dim the lights, get comfortable. Perhaps make yourself a warm drink, and let's slowly wander into the unsettling corridors of history together. History often remembers kings and queens through portraits painted in brilliant colors. We admire jeweled crowns, towering castles, elaborate ceremonies, and endless displays of wealth. Yet portraits rarely capture what happened after the musicians stopped playing and palace doors closed for the evening. They cannot show anxious servants avoiding certain hallways, frightened children learning too early that trust could be dangerous, or nobles carefully choosing every word because one careless sentence might cost them everything. The strange truth is that royal families were often among the least peaceful households in their own kingdoms. Power created a different kind of gravity inside a palace. Every birth changed the future. Every marriage altered alliances. Every illness sparked rumors. Every unexpected death invited questions that sometimes echoed for centuries. A farmer might argue with his brother over a field, but a prince could destroy an entire nation by arguing with his brother over a throne. Our journey begins not with the most famous palace in Europe, nor with the wealthiest empire in Asia, but with an ancient family whose name became almost inseparable from ambition itself. Long before modern governments, newspapers, or constitutions, one dynasty rose above countless rivals through remarkable military victories, brilliant political strategy, and an unwavering belief that they alone were destined to rule. They expanded across mountains, deserts, forests, and rivers, until their lands stretched farther than almost anyone had imagined possible. To outsiders, they appeared unstoppable. Inside their own household, however, a quieter battle was unfolding. This was the family of Alexander the Great. When people think of Alexander, they usually imagine an undefeated conqueror leading armies across Persia, Egypt, and beyond. His achievements were extraordinary. Before reaching the age of 33, he had built one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. Yet, even before his birth, the atmosphere surrounding his family was already thick with rivalry, ambition, and suspicion. His father, King Philip II of Macedon, transformed a relatively modest kingdom into the dominant military power of Greece. Philip was intelligent, relentless, and endlessly ambitious. He reformed the Macedonian army, introduced revolutionary battlefield tactics, and defeated enemies who had underestimated him. But Philip's successes came with another habit that would slowly poison his household. He married again, and again, and again. Royal marriages were rarely about affection. They were political agreements, diplomatic promises wrapped in expensive ceremonies. Every new wife represented another alliance, another powerful family, another region brought closer to Macedon. Yet every marriage also produced new children. Each child created another possible claimant to the throne. Instead of one clear line of succession, Philip's palace slowly filled with competing branches of the same family, each supported by different nobles who believed their preferred prince deserved the crown. Imagine growing up in such an environment. Your cousins might become rivals. Your stepmothers might quietly support someone else's ambitions. Your father's latest marriage could instantly reduce your own importance. Every celebration carried hidden calculations. Every banquet included invisible political negotiations. Alexander's own mother, Olympias, possessed a reputation that fascinated ancient writers for centuries. She came from Epirus, a neighboring kingdom, and unlike many royal women of her era, she refused to remain a silent figure in the background. Ancient historians described her as deeply religious, fiercely intelligent, emotionally intense, and completely devoted to her son's future. Legends surrounded her almost immediately. Some stories claimed she participated in mysterious religious ceremonies involving snakes. Others suggested she encouraged people to believe Alexander's true father was not Philip at all, but the god Zeus himself. Modern historians debate these tales, recognizing that many were likely exaggerated or invented by later writers who delighted in surrounding famous figures with supernatural rumors. Whether those stories were true matters less than one important fact. People believed them, and in royal courts, belief often carried as much influence as reality. Olympias understood something that many underestimated. In monarchies, perception could become power. If enough people believed Alexander possessed divine favor, his claim to greatness appeared stronger than any ordinary prince's. Meanwhile, Philip continued reshaping the political landscape through conquest and marriage alike. Then came one wedding that changed everything. Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman. Unlike Olympias, Cleopatra came from within Macedon's own aristocracy. This mattered enormously. If Cleopatra gave birth to a son, that child could be viewed by some nobles as more completely Macedonian than Alexander, whose mother came from another kingdom. Ancient sources describe a dramatic banquet celebrating this marriage. Wine flowed freely. Voices grew louder. Then one of Cleopatra's relatives reportedly suggested that this marriage might finally produce a legitimate heir. Whether those exact words were spoken remains uncertain. What is certain is that the gathering erupted into conflict. Alexander publicly confronted the insult. Philip, drunk and furious, allegedly tried to attack his own son. Instead, he stumbled and fell. Ancient writers preserved Alexander's cutting remark. Here was the man preparing to conquer Asia, unable even to cross the room without collapsing. Whether every detail happened exactly this way is impossible to prove after more than 2,000 years. Ancient historians often enjoyed dramatic storytelling, yet the larger truth remains. The relationship between father and son had fractured. Soon afterward, Alexander and Olympias temporarily left the court altogether. Imagine the uncertainty. One day you are heir to an expanding kingdom. The next, your father's newest marriage threatens everything your mother has worked toward for decades. Palaces often looked magnificent from outside. Inside, they could resemble carefully decorated battlefields. Servants noticed changing alliances. Generals quietly evaluated future possibilities. Nobles wondered which prince deserved their loyalty. No one could predict who would eventually wear the crown. Then history took an astonishing turn. In 336 BCE, King Philip II attended another wedding celebration. Ceremonies filled the day. Guests gathered. Music echoed through the festivities. At the height of the occasion, one of Philip's own bodyguards approached him. Without warning, the guard stabbed the king. Philip died almost immediately. The assassin attempted to escape, but was quickly caught and killed before lengthy questioning could reveal every possible motive. Almost instantly, rumors spread across the kingdom. Had the assassin acted alone? Had personal revenge motivated him? Had political rivals manipulated him? Were foreign enemies responsible? Or had someone inside the royal family quietly benefited from Philip's sudden death? Ancient historians never reached complete agreement. Some openly accused Olympias. Others hinted at Alexander. Many modern historians remain cautious. Because the evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, and filtered through authors writing generations later. What cannot be denied is how swiftly events unfolded afterward. Alexander became king. Potential rivals disappeared with alarming speed. Several individuals who possessed possible claims to the throne were executed. Cleopatra Eurydice's fate became especially grim. Ancient accounts differ in details, but they generally agree that Olympias played a central role in eliminating both Cleopatra and her young children. The exact methods remain disputed. The atmosphere they describe does not. This was no peaceful transfer of power. It was survival. The ancient world rarely rewarded hesitation. A rival left alive today could become tomorrow's rebellion. Modern readers often recoil from such actions. Yet, within ancient monarchies, Many rulers believed eliminating competitors prevented even greater bloodshed later. Whether that belief proved true is another question entirely. Alexander soon departed on the military campaigns that would define his legend. As he crossed into Asia, conquered Persia, founded cities, and defeated armies that vastly outnumbered his own, another unsettling reality slowly emerged. He had inherited not only Philip's kingdom, he had inherited Philip's family problem. Alexander never produced a universally accepted adult heir before his death. His marriages reflected politics as much as affection. His closest companions gained extraordinary influence. Questions surrounding succession remained unresolved, and unresolved succession inside an absolute monarchy is rather like leaving dry wood beside an open flame. It may remain quiet for a while. Eventually, something catches fire. For more than a decade, Alexander seemed almost invincible. Victories followed victories. Cities surrendered. Kings submitted. His empire stretched farther east than any Macedonian had imagined possible. To soldiers marching beside him, it must have seemed that destiny itself favored their king. Yet destiny has little patience for certainty. In the bustling city of Babylon, after years of relentless campaigning, endless travel, unfamiliar climates, exhausting battles, and unimaginable responsibility, Alexander suddenly fell ill. Ancient sources disagree about nearly every detail. Some blamed fever, others suspected disease. A few whispered poison. Day after day, his condition worsened. The greatest conqueror of his age gradually lost the strength even to speak. Around his bed gathered generals, companions, officials, and anxious attendants. Each understood the terrifying question hanging silently over the room. Who would rule after Alexander? No clear answer existed, and that uncertainty would soon transform one extraordinary royal family into one of history's most tragic examples of how immense power could consume itself from within. Alexander's final days unfolded in remarkable silence. Ancient writers describe his closest officers entering the chamber one by one, finding their king too weak to speak, but still conscious enough to acknowledge them with a faint movement of his eyes. Outside the palace in Babylon, thousands of soldiers gathered, refusing to believe that the man who had led them across continents could simply disappear. Rumors spread through the camps with astonishing speed. Some insisted he would recover within days. Others whispered that foreign physicians had failed him. A few quietly suggested that unseen enemies had accomplished what mighty Persian armies never could. One story, repeated by several ancient historians, though impossible to verify with certainty, claims that Alexander's generals asked him who should inherit the empire. His reply has survived in different forms. Some sources say he answered, "To the strongest." Others argue that these famous words were added later because they perfectly explained the chaos that followed. Whatever he truly said, the practical result was identical. There was no universally accepted successor waiting to receive the crown. For an ordinary family, uncertainty after a death often means disagreements over property, heirlooms, or responsibilities. Within the greatest empire on earth, uncertainty meant something altogether different. Entire provinces waited to discover whose orders they should obey. Powerful governors considered whether loyalty still served their interests. Generals commanding veteran armies began calculating futures that had seemed impossible only days before. Alexander left behind a complicated household rather than a simple line of succession. His wife Roxana was expecting a child, but the baby had not yet been born. His half-brother Erhidius, later known as Philip III, remained alive, yet he was considered mentally incapable of ruling independently. Some officers believed waiting for Roxana's child offered the best solution. Others preferred crowning Erhidius immediately. Behind every proposal stood ambitious men who hoped to guide the empire while another wore the crown. The discussions soon became arguments. The arguments soon became threats. The threats nearly became civil war before Alexander's body had even received its final honors. Eventually, a fragile compromise emerged. Erhidius would become King Philip III, while Roxana's unborn child, if it proved to be a son, would share the throne after birth. It sounded sensible enough on parchment. Reality rarely respects elegant compromises. Neither king possessed genuine authority. Instead, experienced generals governed in their names. This arrangement pleased almost no one. The empire Alexander had assembled through personal leadership now depended upon cooperation among men who had spent years competing for glory. Many admired one another's military abilities. Very few trusted one another completely. The first months after Alexander's death resembled calm water covering dangerous currents. Official ceremonies continued. Decrees were issued. Governors retained their positions. The machinery of empire appeared intact. Beneath the surface, however, every influential figure was quietly strengthening his own position. One general secured additional troops. Another cultivated alliances through marriage. Another sought control of wealthy provinces. Another gained possession of important fortresses. No one openly admitted preparing for future conflict. Almost everyone was doing precisely that. Meanwhile, Alexander's magnificent body became a political prize, unlike any other. In the ancient world, burial carried immense symbolic importance. Possessing the conqueror's remains could strengthen a ruler's legitimacy. Instead of traveling directly to Macedonia, Alexander's funeral procession itself became entangled in political maneuvering. Eventually, his body was taken to Egypt by Ptolemy, one of his trusted companions, where it became the centerpiece of royal prestige for generations. Even in death, Alexander continued shaping the ambitions of powerful men. Then Roxana gave birth. The infant was named Alexander IV. For a brief moment, hope flickered that the dynasty might survive. The child represented continuity. He carried Alexander's blood. He offered supporters a legitimate king around whom loyalty might gather. Unfortunately, Bobbies cannot command armies. They cannot negotiate treaties. They cannot restrain ambitious generals. The empire continued drifting toward fragmentation. Within only a few years, wars erupted between Alexander's former companions. Historians call them the Wars of the Successors, though the title almost sounds too orderly. In reality, they were decades of shifting alliances, betrayals, sieges, assassinations, and battles that gradually shattered one enormous empire into several competing kingdoms. The irony is difficult to overlook. Alexander had defeated rival empires abroad with astonishing efficiency. His own family could not preserve what he created. Perhaps no figure better illustrates this tragedy than Olympia's, the fiercely determined mother who had spent years protecting her son's future, now found herself attempting to protect her grandson. Age had not softened her resolve. She returned to political life with the same intensity that had once made foreign observers both admire and fear her. She believed young Alexander IV deserved the throne. Others believed different arrangements better suited their own ambitions. Conflict became inevitable. Olympias ordered executions. Her opponents responded with military force. Cities changed allegiance. Old friendships dissolved. Former allies became enemies almost overnight. Ancient writers often portray Olympias as unusually ruthless. Yet, it is worth remembering the environment she inhabited. Mercy inside the succession struggles frequently invited disaster. Sparing a rival today could mean one's own execution tomorrow. Still, ruthlessness offered no guarantee of survival. Eventually, Olympias herself became trapped after military defeats weakened her position. Her enemies surrounded the city where she had taken refuge. At first, they hesitated to execute the mother of Alexander the Great. Her name still commanded enormous respect, but respect gradually yielded to political necessity. She was condemned. According to several ancient accounts, soldiers initially refused to carry out the sentence because of who she was. Eventually, relatives of people she had previously ordered executed took revenge themselves. Thus ended one of antiquity's most formidable royal mothers. Her determination had helped elevate her son to history's greatest stage. It could not save her from the violence that consumed nearly everyone around the throne. Young Alexander IV survived his grandmother. For a while, he grew up surrounded by guardians, advisors, and protectors who constantly spoke about preserving his rights. Yet, behind many promises hid another calculation. As long as the boy lived, he represented a legitimate king. Anyone wishing to establish an independent dynasty faced a simple obstacle. Alexander IV existed. Years passed. The child matured. Every birthday brought him closer to adulthood. Every year made him potentially more dangerous to those already ruling in his name. Eventually, one of the most powerful successors, Cassander, reached a conclusion that countless rulers before and after him would also reach, as long as a legitimate claimant remained alive. Absolute security remained impossible. Sometime around 310 BCE, Alexander IV and his mother Roxana quietly disappeared. Later sources agree on the likely explanation. Both were murdered in secret. There were no grand public executions, no dramatic courtroom speeches, no heroic final battle. Instead, the last direct heir of Alexander, the Great, simply vanished from history while still a teenager. The empire had not merely lost its founder, it had extinguished his family. The dynasty that had conquered the known world survived scarcely a generation after Alexander's death. Philip II murdered, Cleopatra Eurydice eliminated, Olympias executed, Roxana murdered, Alexander IV murdered, Arhidius executed. So many lives had revolved around one crown that eventually almost none remained. When people picture royal dynasties, they often imagine stability stretching across centuries. The Macedonian royal house reminds us that astonishing success could prove breathtakingly fragile. Extraordinary military victories could not overcome unresolved succession. Brilliant leadership could not guarantee peaceful inheritance. One family reached heights almost beyond imagination, only to collapse into suspicion, vengeance, and elimination with startling speed. Yet history, as always, refused to pause. While Alexander's descendants disappeared, other royal houses watched closely. They studied what had happened in Macedonia. Some believed stronger succession laws might prevent similar disasters. Others concluded that eliminating rivals earlier offered the safest solution. A few simply repeated the same mistakes under different crowns. Across the Mediterranean, another powerful family was quietly building influence. Unlike the Macedonians, they rarely claimed descent from legendary conquerors. Instead, they mastered politics, patience, and careful image-making. They understood that appearing united could be just as valuable as genuine harmony. For a time, they convinced the world that their household embodied order itself. Behind the marble temples, triumphal processions, and carefully crafted public ceremonies, however, resentment simmered between husbands and wives, parents and children, brothers and sisters. Adoption became a political tool. Exile became a family argument. Suspicious deaths accumulated with uncomfortable frequency. Emperors who ruled millions often trusted almost no one sitting at their own dining table. The family was known as the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and within its elegant palaces, Rome would discover that absolute power could transform even the closest relatives into potential enemies. The rise of the Julio-Claudian dynasty did not begin with an emperor wearing a crown. In fact, Rome prided itself on rejecting kings. For centuries, Roman citizens repeated the story that they had overthrown their last monarch and would never again allow one man to rule absolutely. Public officials were elected. Senators debated policy. Magistrates served fixed terms. At least in theory, Rome remained a republic governed by laws rather than dynasties. Yet history has a habit of changing, while insisting nothing has changed at all. By the 1st century before Christ, ambitious generals commanded armies whose loyalty often belonged more to their commander than to the Roman state. Civil wars became increasingly common. Political violence replaced compromise. Alliances formed and dissolved with astonishing speed, and the old republican system struggled under pressures it had never been designed to endure. Into this uncertain world stepped Gaius Octavius, better known to history as Augustus. He was not born the obvious master of Rome. He was young, physically unimposing, and initially underestimated by older rivals. But he possessed something far more valuable than impressive appearance. He understood patience. Rather than rushing toward absolute power, Augustus moved carefully. He defeated enemies one by one, rewarded loyal supporters generously, and presented himself not as a tyrant, but as the man who had restored peace after decades of bloodshed. Officially, Rome remained a republic. Unofficially, nearly every important decision now flowed through him. The transformation was so gradual that many Romans scarcely noticed how completely the political landscape had changed. Augustus also recognized another lesson. An empire required continuity. The Republic had relied upon elections. His new system depended upon succession. That single problem would haunt his family for generations. Unlike later European monarchies with well-established inheritance traditions, Augustus inherited no clear blueprint for passing imperial authority to the next ruler. Every possible solution created fresh complications. A biological son might be too young. An adopted heir might anger blood relatives. A talented general might become dangerously popular. A marriage could strengthen one branch of the family while weakening another. Nothing about succession felt simple. Augustus married Livia Drusilla, one of the most influential women in Roman history. Ancient writers admired her intelligence, discipline, and political instincts. They also surrounded her with countless rumors. According to hostile historians writing decades later, Livia manipulated nearly every important decision inside the imperial household. Whenever a potential heir died unexpectedly, whispers somehow returned to her name. Modern historians approach these accusations with considerable caution. Most surviving accounts were written long after the events themselves by authors who often delighted in scandal. A woman exercising genuine political influence shocked many Roman writers, making her an easy target for dramatic stories. Still, even if the darker rumors are exaggerated, one fact remains undeniable. Livia became indispensable. Augustus consulted her regularly. She managed enormous estates. She corresponded with officials. She represented stability inside a household where uncertainty never entirely disappeared. Yet, despite all the empire's wealth and sophistication, Augustus encountered a painfully ordinary problem. His family simply refused to cooperate with his plans. The emperor desperately needed a reliable successor. Again and again, fate intervened. His nephew Marcellus died unexpectedly while still young. His trusted general and son-in-law Marcus Agrippa eventually died after years of loyal service. Agrippa's sons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, were carefully prepared for leadership. Augustus publicly promoted them, introduced them to government responsibilities, and encouraged Romans to view them as the empire's future. Then both young men died before reaching full maturity. One illness, another illness, different circumstances, the same heartbreaking result. Each death forced Augustus back to the beginning. Imagine spending decades constructing the future of the world's greatest empire, only to watch every carefully chosen successor disappear. Whether these tragedies resulted from ordinary disease or darker conspiracies remains impossible to prove. Ancient gossip supplied endless accusations. Evidence supplied very few answers. Eventually, Augustus adopted Tiberius, Livia's son from her earlier marriage. Tiberius was experienced, capable, and respected as a military commander. Yet, he never seemed entirely comfortable standing in Augustus' shadow. Reserved by nature, he disliked excessive praise and avoided public displays of warmth. Many contemporaries respected him. Very few described him as charming. When Augustus finally died in AD 14, after ruling for more than 40 years, Rome entered another delicate transition. Tiberius became emperor. The empire remained stable. The palace did not. Almost immediately, relationships within the imperial family grew increasingly tense. One figure attracted extraordinary public affection. Germanicus. He was Tiberius' adopted son, an accomplished general, and immensely popular with both soldiers and civilians. Handsome, charismatic, generous, and successful in military campaigns along Rome's northern frontier, Germanicus seemed to embody every quality Romans admired. Crowds celebrated his victories. Veterans admired his leadership. Even those who respected Tiberius quietly compared the two men. Such comparisons rarely benefit the reigning emperor. Then, while traveling in the eastern provinces, Germanicus suddenly became ill. his condition deteriorated rapidly. Before long, he was dead. The news stunned Rome. Public grief spread throughout the empire. Almost immediately came suspicion. Germanicus himself reportedly believed he had been poisoned. His widow, Agrippina the Elder, returned to Rome, carrying her husband's ashes and demanding justice. Whether poison truly caused his death remains one of ancient history's enduring mysteries. Disease was common. Medical understanding remained limited. Countless illnesses could become fatal with frightening speed, but ordinary illness rarely satisfies political imagination. Romans searched desperately for someone to blame. Attention soon focused upon Gnaeus Piso, the governor of Syria, who had clashed repeatedly with Germanicus. Piso eventually stood trial before committing suicide before the legal proceedings reached their conclusion. Did Piso act independently? Did others encourage him? Did Tiberius secretly approve? Ancient historians disagreed passionately. Modern scholars remain divided. The uncertainty itself became part of the dynasty's reputation. Inside the imperial household, trust continued eroding. Agrippina openly criticized Tiberius. The emperor increasingly viewed parts of his own family with suspicion. Exiles followed. Accusations multiplied. Relatives who once shared banquets now avoided one another. One individual gradually accumulated astonishing influence during these troubled years. Lucius Aelius Sejanus. Officially, he served as commander of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor. Unofficially, he became something far more dangerous. He controlled access. He filtered information. He influenced appointments. Visitors seeking imperial favor often discovered that pleasing Sejanus proved almost as important as pleasing Tiberius himself. As Tiberius withdrew from public life, Sejanus filled the vacuum. The emperor eventually left Rome altogether, settling on the island of Capri. Ancient descriptions of his retirement vary dramatically. Some depict peaceful withdrawal from exhausting political life. Others portray shocking excesses and moral corruption. Many of the most sensational stories come from hostile writers, whose accounts deserve careful skepticism. What is certain is that distance changed government. With the emperor far away, Sejanus exercised enormous practical authority in Rome. He wasted little time. Members of the imperial family suddenly found themselves accused of treason. Trials became increasingly common. Property was confiscated. Exile replaced influence. Executions followed convictions. Fear settled across Rome like a persistent fog. No one knew who might be accused next. Friendships became liabilities. Associating with the wrong person could prove disastrous. Even silence sometimes invited suspicion. The imperial household increasingly resembled a place where everyone watched everyone else. Servants listened carefully. Officials measured every sentence. Letters were written cautiously. One misunderstood remark could alter an entire family's future. Eventually, Sejanus reached the height of his power. Some contemporaries believed he intended to marry into the imperial family. Others suspected he dreamed of becoming emperor himself. If so, he badly underestimated Tiberius. In AD 31, events changed with astonishing speed. The Senate assembled, expecting routine business. Instead, a letter arrived from Capri. At first, the message praised Sejanus. Then the tone shifted. Gradually, accusations appeared. By the end of the letter, senators realized the emperor had turned completely against his trusted minister. Panic swept through the chamber. Only moments earlier, praising Sejanus had seemed politically wise. Now association with him appeared fatal. Sejanus was arrested immediately. Before the day ended, he had been executed. His children followed. His supporters disappeared into prisons. Statues honoring him were smashed. His name became something to erase rather than celebrate. The transformation was breathtaking. One sunrise found him among the empire's most powerful men. The next sunrise found him dead. Yet removing Sejanus solved surprisingly little. The culture of suspicion remained. Informers continued accusing rivals. Trials continued. Executions continued. The imperial family had survived another internal crisis, but at considerable emotional cost. Years of fear leave lasting scars. When Tiberius finally died in AD 37, Rome greeted the announcement not with overwhelming sorrow, but with cautious optimism. A new emperor approached. His name was Gaius. History remembers him by a childhood nickname given by soldiers, Caligula. At first, celebrations filled the streets. The young emperor appeared generous, approachable, and energetic. Prisoners were released. Political exiles returned. Crowds rejoiced that a brighter chapter had finally begun. Few could imagine that the Julio-Claudian family was about to enter one of its darkest and most disturbing periods, where affection between relatives would become almost impossible to separate from fear, and where the palace itself would once again transform into a place where survival depended as much upon luck as loyalty. Caligula was only 24 years old when he became emperor. For the ordinary people of Rome, his accession felt almost like the arrival of spring after a long and difficult winter. Tiberius had spent his final years far from the capital, and many Romans had grown weary of endless treason trials, political suspicion, and whispered accusations. The young emperor seemed to promise something entirely different. Crowds lined the streets to greet him. Temples filled with offerings. Public celebrations lasted for days. Many citizens believed they were witnessing the beginning of another golden age. The optimism was understandable. Caligula possessed a remarkable story that inspired sympathy long before he ruled. As a small child, he had accompanied his father Germanicus on military campaigns along the Rhine frontier. The soldiers adored him. They dressed him in a miniature military uniform, complete with tiny soldiers' boots called asterisk caligae. The affectionate nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, followed him into adulthood, though ancient writers note that he personally disliked it. His childhood, however, had been anything but peaceful. He watched members of his own family disappear, one after another. His beloved father died under mysterious circumstances. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, eventually fell from imperial favor and was exiled. His brothers suffered similar fates. One died in prison. Another was reportedly forced to take his own life. Whether every accusation against them had been justified hardly mattered anymore. The young Caligula learned one lesson that many princes before him had also learned. Within an imperial family, blood offered no guarantee of safety. Perhaps that experience shaped the ruler he would later become. Perhaps it did not. Historians have debated the question for nearly 2,000 years. During the first several months of his reign, Caligula behaved much as Rome had hoped. He honored the memory of his parents. He arranged magnificent public games. He distributed generous gifts to citizens. He recalled individuals who had been unjustly exiled. Taxes were eased in several areas. The atmosphere inside Rome noticeably brightened. Even ancient historians, who later condemned him, acknowledged that the beginning of his reign inspired widespread enthusiasm. Then something changed. Only a few months after becoming emperor, Caligula suffered a severe illness. The exact nature of this sickness remains unknown. Ancient writers describe high fever. Some mention prolonged unconsciousness. Others simply state that the emperor came dangerously close to death. Rome waited anxiously. When he recovered, people celebrated. Yet many later observers believed the man who emerged from that illness differed profoundly from the one who had entered it. Whether this transformation resulted from disease affecting his mind, psychological trauma accumulated throughout his childhood, or hostile historians exaggerating his later behavior, remains one of history's great uncertainties. What is certain is that his government gradually became increasingly unpredictable. Soon, executions resumed. Some senators found themselves accused of conspiracy. Others lost their fortunes. Several wealthy Romans were compelled to leave enormous estates to the emperor in their wills. The line between justice and political convenience grew increasingly difficult to distinguish. Inside the palace, relationships became even more unsettling. Caligula had 3 sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla, and Livilla. He openly displayed unusual affection toward them, particularly Drusilla. Ancient writers, especially Suetonius and Cassius Dio, later accused Caligula of maintaining incestuous relationships with his sisters. Modern historians urge caution. These authors wrote decades after the events and frequently included sensational stories about unpopular emperors. Accusations of sexual misconduct became a common literary device used to portray rulers as morally corrupt. Whether these specific allegations were true remains impossible to establish. Yet even if exaggerated, the rumors themselves reveal something important. The imperial household had become surrounded by scandals so extraordinary that almost any story found willing listeners. When Drusilla died unexpectedly, Caligula's grief astonished Rome. He declared a period of national mourning. Public laughter became inappropriate. Certain celebrations were temporarily forbidden. Drusilla received honors approaching those normally reserved for gods. The emperor appeared devastated. To many Romans, his mourning seemed genuine. To others, it seemed excessive. Either way, his emotional state appeared increasingly unstable. As months passed, stories about strange behavior multiplied. Ancient historians claimed he ordered expensive bridges, constructed merely to satisfy personal whims. They described lavish banquets where unimaginable sums vanished in a single evening. They accused him of humiliating senators by forcing them to run beside his chariot for miles beneath the hot Italian sun. Some tales portray him conversing with statues of gods. Others suggest he expected divine worship during his own lifetime. One famous story claims he planned to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul. The image has survived for centuries because it seems almost unbelievable. But did it actually happen? Probably not in the way later generations imagined. Most modern historians suspect the story functioned more as political satire than literal history. Caligula may have joked that his horse could perform government duties as competently as certain senators. His enemies, delighted by the insult, preserved the joke as though it reflected reality. The distinction matters. Separating fact from hostile propaganda becomes increasingly difficult when studying ancient rulers. Nevertheless, beneath the exaggerated anecdotes lies a consistent pattern. Caligula delighted in shocking Rome's traditional elite. He enjoyed demonstrating that the emperor stood above ordinary customs. He frequently ignored conventions that previous rulers had respected. Such behavior gradually transformed admiration into fear. No one knew how he might react. A compliment might earn reward. The same compliment, delivered on another day, might provoke anger. Predictability disappeared. Inside the palace, uncertainty became a permanent companion. Servants developed extraordinary sensitivity to the emperor's moods. Courtiers studied his expressions before speaking. Meals proceeded cautiously. Conversations remained brief. Even experienced officials struggled to anticipate which subjects pleased him and which invited danger. Meanwhile, members of his own family watched events unfold with growing concern. Among them stood Agrippina the Younger. Unlike many women of the imperial household, Agrippina possessed remarkable intelligence, determination, and political awareness. She carefully observed everything around her. Her childhood had taught survival. Her brother's reign reinforced those lessons. She understood that fortunes within the palace could reverse almost overnight. Eventually, conspiracy returned, whether prompted by genuine concern for Rome, personal ambition, or simple fear of Caligula's increasingly erratic rule. Several influential figures plotted against the emperor. The conspiracy included members of the Praetorian Guard itself. That detail mattered enormously. The emperor's protectors had become his greatest threat. On a January day in AD 41, Caligula attended public entertainments connected with religious festivals. After leaving the theater through a covered passageway beneath the palace complex, he became separated from the larger crowd. It was there that officers of the Praetorian Guard attacked. The assault lasted only moments. Caligula fell beneath repeated sword blows. He was 28 years old. The violence did not end with him. His wife Caesonia was also killed. Their young daughter met the same tragic fate. Ancient writers describe the child being struck against a wall. One of the most disturbing episodes associated with the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Whether every detail has been preserved accurately is impossible to know. The outcome, however, is beyond dispute. An entire, immediate family vanished within hours. Once again, the imperial palace echoed with hurried footsteps, shouted orders, and terrified uncertainty. The assassins believed they had liberated Rome. Instead, they created another succession crisis. Senators rushed into emergency meetings. Some argued that the time had finally come to restore the old republic. Others feared civil war. The Praetorian Guard searched the palace. Servants hid. Members of the imperial household scattered, uncertain who might become the next target. According to one of history's most remarkable stories, a frightened elderly man concealed himself behind a curtain inside the palace. A soldier noticed trembling feet beneath the fabric. Pulling the curtain aside, he discovered Claudius. Few had seriously considered him a future emperor. Since childhood, Claudius had suffered from physical disabilities that affected his speech and movements. Ancient relatives often underestimated him, assuming these conditions reflected intellectual weakness. They were profoundly mistaken, because many family members dismissed him as harmless. Claudius had survived, while more obvious heirs disappeared. His very lack of political visibility had become protection. The soldiers immediately hailed him as emperor. Within hours, Rome once again possessed a ruler. The Republic remained only a distant memory. Yet the Julio-Claudian family had learned nothing from decades of bloodshed. Behind Claudius waited new marriages, new rivalries, ambitious relatives, poisoned suspicions, and one woman whose determination to place her own son upon the throne would make her one of the most formidable and feared figures in all of Roman history. Her name was Agrippina the Younger. If the Julio-Claudian dynasty had produced a single person who seemed capable of surviving almost every political storm, it was Agrippina the Younger. She had been born into extraordinary privilege, yet privilege in Rome came wrapped in constant danger. Before reaching adulthood, she had witnessed the mysterious death of her father Germanicus, the exile and slow decline of her mother Agrippina the Elder, the destruction of two brothers, the suspicious atmosphere surrounding Emperor Tiberius, the brief and increasingly unstable reign of her brother Caligula, and finally, his violent assassination. Many people would have been broken by such a childhood. Agrippina learned from it instead. She observed that affection rarely protected anyone inside the imperial household. Only influence did. After Caligula's death, Claudius unexpectedly became emperor. To many senators, he seemed an unlikely choice. For years, members of his own family had largely ignored him. Ancient authors describe him as awkward in public, sometimes stammering, occasionally limping, and often appearing absent-minded. Modern historians believe these descriptions were unfairly exaggerated. Claudius proved to be an intelligent administrator. He expanded Rome's bureaucracy, improved legal procedures, strengthened the empire's finances, and even oversaw the successful conquest of Britain. While later generations often remembered him through palace scandals, his actual government accomplished a great deal. Unfortunately for Claudius, competence in administration did not guarantee peace inside his own household. His private life quickly became the empire's favorite subject of gossip. His third wife, Valeria Messalina, entered Roman history with one of the darkest reputations of any imperial woman. Ancient writers portrayed her as dangerously ambitious, endlessly unfaithful, and willing to remove anyone standing between herself and greater influence. As with so many figures from antiquity, modern historians urge caution. Nearly all surviving accounts were written by male aristocrats decades after her death. Roman historians often depicted politically influential women in deeply hostile ways, combining fact with rumor, until the two became almost impossible to separate. Even allowing for exaggeration, however, Messalina's story ended dramatically. By the late 40s AD, rumors reached Claudius that his wife had entered into an astonishingly reckless relationship with the Roman senator Gaius Silius. Some sources claimed they had gone so far as to stage a marriage ceremony, while Claudius himself remained alive. Whether this event occurred exactly as described remains uncertain. What matters is that the emperor believed, or was persuaded to believe, that a conspiracy threatened both his throne and his life. The response was swift. Silius was executed. Messalina fled. For a brief moment, she reportedly hoped to plead directly with Claudius. She never received the opportunity. Imperial officials reached her first. Ancient writers state that she hesitated when ordered to take her own life, forcing a soldier to complete the execution. Her children survived. She did not. The palace once again found itself without an empress. It did not remain that way for long. Several influential advisors immediately began recommending potential wives for Claudius. Each candidate brought political advantages. Each also represented different factions within Rome. Among them stood Agrippina the Younger. She possessed an impressive lineage. She was the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, the niece of Claudius himself, and the mother of a young boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. History remembers that child by another name, Nero. The proposal, however, presented one significant complication. Agrippina was Claudius' niece. Roman law at the time prohibited marriage between uncle and niece. Rather than abandoning the idea, the Senate simply altered the law. The marriage proceeded. This decision illustrates something remarkable about imperial Rome. Laws increasingly adapted themselves to the emperor's wishes rather than the other way around. Once Agrippina entered the palace as empress, her influence expanded with astonishing speed. Ancient coins began displaying her image alongside Claudius. Statues honored her. Foreign ambassadors recognized her importance. Official ceremonies frequently placed her beside the emperor. Few Roman women had ever exercised such visible authority. Naturally, this visibility attracted criticism. Ancient historians accused Agrippina of controlling Claudius completely. They described the emperor as weak, easily manipulated, and dominated by stronger personalities around him. Modern scholarship paints a more balanced picture. Claudius certainly valued her advice. That does not necessarily mean he surrendered every decision. Still, Agrippina clearly possessed ambitious plans. Her greatest concern centered upon her son. Nero was not Claudius' biological child. The emperor already had a natural son, Britannicus, by ordinary expectation. Britannicus should eventually inherit imperial authority. Agrippina intended otherwise. Patiently, carefully, she reshaped the future. First came adoption. Claudius formally adopted Nero into the imperial family. The young prince suddenly acquired stronger legal standing. Next came education. Agrippina arranged for Nero to receive instruction from one of Rome's most respected philosophers, Lucius Annius Seneca. Seneca had spent years in exile before returning to become Nero's tutor. He believed wisdom, moderation, and self-control formed the foundation of good government. Whether his student embraced those ideals would become another matter entirely. Agrippina also cultivated powerful allies within the Praetorian Guard. One appointment proved especially significant. Sextus Afranius Burrus became commander of the guard. His loyalty toward Agrippina strengthened Nero's position enormously. Gradually, the balance inside the palace shifted. Nero gained prominence. Britannicus seemed increasingly overlooked. Even public ceremonies reflected this changing reality. When Nero reached adolescence, he married Claudius' daughter Octavia, further reinforcing his connection to the imperial family. The emperor now possessed two potential heirs, one biological, one adopted. History had demonstrated repeatedly that such arrangements rarely ended peacefully. Then Claudius' health began declining. He was approaching his mid-60s, an advanced age by Roman standards. Minor illnesses became more frequent. Concern spread quietly through the palace. Whoever succeeded him would determine the future not merely of one family, but of an empire stretching from Britain to the Middle East. Ancient historians unanimously agree that Claudius died after eating mushrooms. Beyond that point, certainty dissolves. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, all present versions of the same accusation. Agrippina poisoned her husband. Different authors provide different details. Some describe poisoned mushrooms. Others introduce physicians, completing the task after the initial poison proved insufficient. Still others embellish the story with dramatic conversations impossible to verify. Modern historians remain skeptical. Claudius was elderly. Natural illness remains entirely plausible. No physical evidence survives. The ancient writers themselves contradict one another. Yet, regardless of the actual cause, many contemporaries believed poison had played a role. That belief alone profoundly shaped Agrippina's reputation for centuries afterward. Claudius died in AD 54. The transition occurred with remarkable efficiency. Before many Romans even learned the emperor had passed away, the Praetorian Guard proclaimed Nero the new ruler. He was only 16 years old. Britannicus remained alive, but he remained overlooked. For the moment, the young emperor began his reign under unusually favorable circumstances. He possessed respected advisors. Seneca offered philosophical guidance. Burrus maintained military discipline. Agrippina herself expected considerable influence. Many Romans hoped this combination would produce wise government. Indeed, Nero's earliest years appeared surprisingly successful. Taxes were moderated. Justice became somewhat fairer. Public entertainments continued. Government generally functioned effectively. Some historians regard these first years as among the better periods of Julio-Claudian administration. Yet beneath the calm surface, familiar tensions slowly returned. Agrippina expected gratitude. Nero increasingly desired independence. A mother who had spent years securing her son's throne naturally assumed continued authority. A teenage emperor gradually discovered he disliked sharing power. The distance between them widened. Small disagreements became public embarrassments. Meetings grew tense. Advisors quietly chose sides. Agrippina reportedly reminded Nero that Britannicus still lived and possessed a stronger claim by blood. Whether she intended the statement as warning or threat scarcely mattered. Nero heard it differently. Soon afterward came another sudden death. Britannicus collapsed during a banquet after drinking wine. Ancient sources describe guests watching in stunned silence as the young prince struggled to breathe. Nero calmly explained that Britannicus occasionally suffered epileptic seizures. The explanation convinced few observers. Poison became the obvious suspicion. Modern historians cannot establish exactly what happened. Illness remains possible. Poison remains equally possible. Either way, the consequence proved unmistakable. The last obvious rival to Nero's throne disappeared before reaching adulthood. Once again, the Julio-Claudian family had solved a succession problem by losing another member. The pattern had become almost painfully familiar. An ambitious household, multiple heirs, growing suspicion, a sudden death, temporary stability, then another crisis, waiting patiently beyond the horizon. Nero now ruled without serious dynastic competition. Ironically, the greatest challenge awaiting him no longer came from forgotten princes or ambitious senators. It came from the very woman who had devoted years to placing him on the throne. Agrippina had created an emperor. She was about to discover that emperors often stopped listening once they no longer needed help climbing to power. For a brief period after Nero became emperor, Rome witnessed an unusual arrangement. Officially, the empire belonged to the 16-year-old ruler. Unofficially, many important decisions still passed through three experienced figures: his mother, Agrippina, his tutor, Seneca, and the commander of the Praetorian Guard, Burrus. Each believed they understood what was best for the young emperor. Each expected to shape his future. At first, their cooperation appeared remarkably successful. Government remained efficient. Taxes stayed reasonable, and provincial governors reported fewer abuses than many had anticipated. To ordinary Romans, the transition from Claudius to Nero seemed almost effortless. Inside the palace, however, another quiet struggle had already begun. Agrippina had not devoted years to securing Nero's throne, only to retire into comfortable obscurity. Ancient writers describe her attending official meetings, receiving foreign ambassadors, and occasionally expecting to be consulted on matters that previous imperial women had rarely discussed. One famous story claims that during an audience with foreign envoys, Agrippina attempted to sit beside Nero on the imperial platform itself. According to Tacitus, advisors hurriedly prevented the scene from unfolding, fearing it would suggest that Rome possessed not one ruler, but two. Whether every detail occurred exactly as described is uncertain, yet the broader picture appears convincing. Agrippina's influence was immense. Nero increasingly resented it. The tension between mother and son did not erupt all at once. Instead, it unfolded through countless small moments. A suggestion politely ignored, an invitation quietly declined, an advisor encouraged to spend less time with Agrippina, a conversation shortened, a disagreement left unresolved. Such moments rarely attract attention when they occur. Accumulated over months, they transform relationships. Nero also entered a new stage of life. Like many young rulers before him, he desired independence, admiration, and personal freedom. He developed interests extending beyond government. Music fascinated him. Poetry captivated him. Acting appealed to his imagination in ways that shocked Rome's conservative elite. To modern audiences, an emperor enjoying artistic performance may seem harmless. To Roman aristocrats, it appeared deeply unsettling. The emperor represented dignity, discipline, and military authority. Actors occupied one of the lowest social positions in Roman society. For Nero to perform publicly blurred boundaries many Romans believed should never be crossed. Agrippina reportedly disliked these developments. She had not engineered her son's rise, so he could become known primarily as a performer. She envisioned a disciplined ruler. Nero increasingly envisioned himself as something far more unusual. At the same time, another person entered his life, a woman named Poppaea Sabina. Ancient historians describe Poppaea as extraordinarily beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. Like many influential women in Roman history, her reputation became tangled in admiration and accusation alike. She understood the emperor. More importantly, she understood what he wanted to hear, where Agrippina reminded Nero of responsibility. Poppaea reportedly encouraged his independence, where his mother recalled childhood. Poppaea represented adulthood. The contrast proved significant. Gradually, Nero distanced himself further from Agrippina. He reduced her ceremonial honors. Her political influence diminished. Visitors who once sought her approval increasingly bypassed her altogether. For someone accustomed to extraordinary authority, the change must have been profound. Ancient sources suggest Agrippina reacted with growing frustration. Some claim she threatened to support other claimants. Others portray her reminding Nero that she had secured his throne. Whether these conversations occurred exactly as reported cannot be confirmed. They nevertheless reflect a believable reality. Mother and son had become political rivals. Once such a transformation occurs inside an absolute monarchy, reconciliation becomes increasingly difficult. Around AD 59, the relationship reached its breaking point. What followed ranks among the most astonishing episodes preserved in Roman history. According to Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, Nero concluded that his mother represented a permanent danger. Eliminating her by open execution risked public outrage. A subtler solution seemed preferable. The emperor allegedly arranged an elaborate deception. Agrippina received an invitation to reconcile with her son during a religious festival near the Bay of Naples. The atmosphere appeared warm. Conversations remained pleasant. The visit ended amicably. As night approached, Nero insisted she return home aboard a specially prepared vessel. The ship itself concealed a deadly design. Ancient historians claim sections of the roof had been engineered to collapse. If that failed, the vessel would supposedly break apart at sea. The accident would appear entirely natural. The emperor's greatest political obstacle would quietly disappear. If true, it was an extraordinarily elaborate assassination attempt. It also failed spectacularly. The roof collapsed, but did not kill Agrippina. The ship began sinking. Confusion erupted among passengers. Some drowned. Others struggled desperately in the dark water. Agrippina, despite her age, reportedly managed to swim toward shore. Imagine the scene. Moonlight reflecting across the sea. Broken timbers floating between terrified survivors. An elderly woman, once the most powerful in Rome, dragging herself through cold water, while realizing that her own son had almost certainly attempted to murder her. Whether every dramatic detail has survived accurately remains impossible to determine. What happened next appears much less doubtful. Agrippina reached land alive. News quickly traveled. Nero panicked. His carefully disguised accident had failed. Now his intended victim knew the truth, or at least strongly suspected it. According to ancient accounts, the emperor gathered trusted advisors. Panic replaced careful planning. Eventually, soldiers received direct orders. This time, there would be no complicated machinery, no collapsing roof, no staged maritime disaster, only armed men. Late that night, they arrived at Agrippina's villa. She reportedly understood immediately why they had come. The ancient historian Tacitus preserves one of the most famous final scenes in Roman literature. As soldiers entered her chamber, Agrippina is said to have pointed toward her womb and declared, "Strike here first." Whether she truly spoke those exact words cannot be known. Ancient historians often crafted memorable speeches to capture emotional truth rather than literal dialogue. The symbolism, however, proved powerful. The body that had given birth to an emperor would die by that emperor's command. The soldiers completed their task. Agrippina, the younger, was dead. Nero reportedly attempted to justify the killing by claiming his mother had plotted against him. Official announcements described her as a dangerous conspirator whose death had saved the empire, many Romans remained unconvinced, even among those accustomed to palace violence. Matricide occupied a uniquely horrifying place. Roman religion and culture emphasized respect toward parents. Killing one's own mother violated not merely social custom, but fundamental moral expectations. Ancient authors suggest Nero himself struggled afterward. Some describe nightmares. Others claim he believed he was haunted by Agrippina's spirit. Whether these stories reflect psychological reality or later literary embellishment, they illustrate how profoundly the event shocked Roman imagination. The emperor had crossed a line few believed imaginable. After Agrippina's death, Nero's government gradually changed. Seneca retained influence for a time. Burrus continued serving loyally. Yet the quiet restraint both men encouraged weakened year by year. The emperor increasingly relied upon companions who applauded rather than questioned him. Constructive criticism became rarer. Flattery became common. This pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout history. The longer absolute rulers remain surrounded only by agreement, the more difficult reality becomes to recognize. Then another loss reshaped the imperial household. In AD 62, Burrus died. Whether illness or poison caused his death remains uncertain. Ancient rumors again multiplied without decisive evidence. His absence removed one of the few experienced figures capable of balancing Nero's impulses. Soon afterward, Seneca requested permission to retire from public life. Officially, the philosopher cited age and declining health. Unofficially, many believed he recognized that his advice no longer carried meaningful weight. The young student he had once instructed now preferred admiration over guidance. Without Burrus, without Seneca's regular influence, without Agrippina, Nero stood more alone than ever before. Ironically, achieving complete independence did not bring lasting security. Instead, it left the emperor increasingly isolated inside the magnificent palace. His family had spent generations fighting to control. Outside Rome, the empire remained vast. Legions guarded distant frontiers. Merchants crossed the Mediterranean. Cities prospered. Inside the imperial residence, however, another invisible transformation had begun. The cautious young ruler of AD 54 was slowly becoming a man whose decisions would soon leave an indelible mark on Roman history, not because of wise administration, but because one catastrophic event would forever intertwine his name with fire, fear, and one of the most famous disasters of the ancient world. The Great Fire of Rome was approaching. In the summer of AD 64, Rome stood as one of the greatest cities the ancient world had ever known. Its streets were crowded with merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, politicians, slaves, and travelers from every corner of the empire. marble temples rose beside crowded apartment buildings. Wealthy citizens lived in luxurious villas decorated with paintings and mosaics, while ordinary families occupied tall wooden apartment blocks called *insulae*, where fires were an ever-present danger. Rome was magnificent. Rome was also vulnerable. The city was a maze of narrow streets, wooden structures, cooking fires, workshops, and crowded neighborhoods. Ancient Rome had no modern firefighting system capable of controlling a disaster of enormous scale. Small flames were common. Entire neighborhoods disappearing into smoke was a nightmare everyone understood. Then, during the night of July 18, a fire began near the Circus Maximus. Exactly how it started remains uncertain. Ancient writers offered different explanations. Some blamed careless merchants. Others suggested criminals, and some accused Nero himself. The accusation became one of the most famous stories about the emperor. According to hostile accounts, Nero watched the city burn from a private location while playing music and comparing the flames to the destruction of legendary cities. It is an unforgettable image. It is also one that historians treat carefully. The earliest surviving sources do not all agree. Some writers, hostile toward Nero, repeated the accusation as fact. Others mention that the emperor organized relief efforts, opened public buildings for displaced citizens, and provided assistance to those who lost homes. Modern historians generally consider the claim that Nero deliberately started the fire uncertain. The reality was likely more complicated. What is certain is the scale of the disaster. For 6 days, flames spread through Rome. Then, after a brief pause, the fire returned. Entire districts vanished. Thousands of people lost their homes. Ancient sources disagree about the number of deaths, but everyone agrees that the destruction was enormous. The emperor faced a crisis, unlike anything he had experienced. The city that represented Roman greatness had been wounded. Nero responded with rebuilding efforts. New building regulations were introduced. Some streets were widened. Structures were designed with greater attention to safety. A new palace complex, the Domus Aurea, was also constructed after the fire. A decision that later fueled accusations that Nero had used tragedy to create a personal paradise. The palace was extraordinary. Gardens stretched across vast areas. Walls were covered with expensive decorations. Rooms were designed to impress visitors with artistic innovation and luxury. To supporters, it represented Roman creativity. To critics, it represented a ruler who transformed public suffering into private pleasure. The fire also created another problem. Nero needed someone to blame. Public anger demanded an explanation. The emperor's advisors searched for a target. Eventually, suspicion fell upon a small and relatively unknown religious group living within Rome. The Christians, at this time, Christianity was not the powerful global religion it would later become. It was a small movement whose followers were often misunderstood by Roman society. Their beliefs appeared strange to many outsiders. They refused to worship traditional Roman gods and rejected participation in certain religious ceremonies connected with the empire. This made them vulnerable. Nero accused them of responsibility for the fire. Large numbers were arrested. Many were executed in brutal public spectacles. Ancient Christian writers later preserved these events as some of the earliest major persecutions against their community. Whether Nero personally believed Christians caused the fire is uncertain. Political necessity may have mattered more than genuine belief. The emperor needed to redirect public anger. A small, unpopular group provided a convenient explanation. The persecution revealed something important about the Roman imperial system. The emperor did not merely control armies and government offices. He controlled narratives, the ability to define who was responsible for a disaster could determine survival. The same pattern had appeared repeatedly inside royal families. Power depended not only on actions, but on convincing others that those actions were justified. After the fire, Nero continued moving further away from traditional expectations of Roman leadership. His passion for music and theater became increasingly public. He participated in Greek-style artistic competitions. He performed before audiences. He wanted recognition not only as ruler, but as artist. To many Romans, this seemed deeply inappropriate. A Roman emperor was expected to command armies, administer justice, and embody strength. Nero wanted something different. He wanted admiration. He wanted applause. He wanted people to recognize his talent. The problem was that emperors possessed enormous power. When an ordinary performer seeks approval, failure brings embarrassment. When an emperor seeks approval, people often pretend to admire him because refusing carries consequences. This created a dangerous environment. Nero increasingly received praise that may not have been sincere. The louder the applause became, the harder it became for him to know whether anyone was telling the truth. Meanwhile, dissatisfaction grew among some military commanders and senators. The emperor's artistic ambitions, financial demands, and unpredictable behavior created resentment. In AD 65, another conspiracy emerged. It became known as the Pisonian Conspiracy, named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy Roman nobleman who was allegedly chosen as a replacement emperor. The conspiracy included senators, soldiers, and members of Nero's own household. Once again, the palace became a place where trust disappeared. The plot was discovered before it could succeed. Nero responded with mass arrests. Those suspected of involvement were forced to die. Among the condemned was Seneca, the philosopher who had once guided the young emperor, received orders take his own life. According to ancient accounts, Seneca remained calm. He opened his veins, according to Roman custom. When death came slowly, he entered a warm bath. His wife, Pompeia Paulina, reportedly attempted to die alongside him, though Nero later ordered that she be saved. Whether the final details occurred exactly as described is debated. The symbolic meaning remained powerful. The teacher of Nero died because of the actions of the student he once hoped to guide. Another victim of the conspiracy was Petronius, a wealthy court figure often identified as the author of the famous work Satyricon Asterisk. Ancient writers describe him as Nero's former favorite, someone who understood luxury and entertainment better than almost anyone. When he fell out of favor, he too was ordered to die. Rather than waiting for execution, Petronius reportedly held a final dinner party, opened his veins, and spent his final hours discussing poetry and conversation. The stories surrounding these deaths reveal the strange world of imperial Rome. The powerful lived surrounded by luxury. They also lived surrounded by fear. A senator could possess enormous wealth and still lose everything because of a single accusation. A trusted advisor could guide the emperor for years and then receive a death sentence. A family member could help create a ruler and eventually become that ruler's enemy. The Julio-Claudian dynasty continued repeating the same tragic pattern. The closer someone stood to absolute power, the more dangerous that position often became. By the late 60s AD, Nero's popularity had collapsed among many influential Romans. The empire still functioned. The armies still guarded the borders. Taxes still flowed into the treasury. But the relationship between emperor and elite had fractured beyond repair. Then came another crisis. A rebellion began in the provinces. At first, Nero underestimated it. He believed loyalty to the imperial system would overcome any challenge. He was wrong. One by one, powerful commanders withdrew their support. The man who had spent years demanding absolute loyalty discovered that loyalty could disappear with astonishing speed. In AD 68, the governor of Hispania, Galba, was proclaimed emperor by his troops. The rebellion spread. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. For the first time in his life, the emperor who had controlled the fate of others faced the possibility of losing everything. The palace that had once protected him now felt like a prison. The servants who once rushed to obey him became uncertain. The guards who had defended emperors for generations no longer seemed reliable. Nero fled Rome. The ruler who inherited one of the world's greatest empires found himself hiding from the very system he represented. According to ancient accounts, when he realized capture was inevitable, Nero prepared to end his own life. His final words, preserved by later writers, reflected his obsession with performance and recognition. he reportedly lamented that a great artist was dying. Whether he truly said these words cannot be proven, but the statement captured how history remembered him, not as a successful administrator, not as a military conqueror, but as a tragic figure whose desire for admiration became inseparable from fear and destruction. Nero died in AD 68 at the age of 30. With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. A family that had transformed Rome forever disappeared from the imperial stage. Augustus had created a system that depended upon family continuity. Yet generation after generation, that same family was destroyed by rivalry, suspicion, and the dangerous struggle for succession. But the story of disturbing royal families did not end with Rome. Far away, in another part of the world, another dynasty would rise to unimaginable wealth and power. Their rulers built magnificent palaces, commanded enormous armies, and claimed a divine connection to the heavens. Yet inside their royal household, brothers would fight brothers, sons would challenge fathers, and the pursuit of the throne would lead to some of history's most dramatic acts of betrayal. The next chapter of our journey would take us to the imperial courts of ancient Persia, where the line between family loyalty and deadly ambition became almost impossible to recognize. The dragon throne was more than a seat of power. For thousands of years in China, the emperor was considered the connection between heaven and earth. His authority was not simply political. It carried a spiritual meaning. The emperor was believed to possess the mandate of heaven, a divine approval that justified his rule. If the empire prospered, if harvests were plentiful, and if society remained stable, people believed heaven supported the emperor. But if disasters occurred, rebellions spread, or corruption became unbearable, many began to question whether heaven had withdrawn its favor. This idea made the emperor extraordinarily powerful. It also made failure extraordinarily dangerous. A Chinese emperor did not merely need to defeat enemies. He needed to maintain the appearance of cosmic order, and nowhere was that pressure more intense than inside the imperial family itself. The palace was filled with princes, consorts, officials, and servants, all connected to the future of the empire. A son born to the wrong mother could become a threat. A brother with military support could become a rival. A talented official who gained too much influence could become dangerous. The imperial court was a world where family affection and political survival often existed in constant conflict. One of the earliest and most dramatic examples came from the Han Dynasty, one of China's greatest imperial houses. The Han Dynasty ruled for more than 4 centuries and created many traditions that shaped Chinese civilization. Its emperors expanded territory, developed government institutions, and encouraged education and culture. Yet behind the achievements of the dynasty existed a recurring problem. The emperor's household During the reign of Emperor Wu of Han, the empire reached extraordinary heights. Emperor Wu was ambitious, energetic, and determined to strengthen China's position against powerful nomadic groups such as the Xiongnu. His military campaigns expanded Han influence across vast territories. His government became more centralized. His court became one of the most impressive political centers in the ancient world. But Emperor Wu's personal life contained a tragedy that would influence Chinese history for generations. The emperor had many wives and concubines, as was common for rulers of the era. Each woman represented more than companionship. Each represented a potential political faction. A son born to an influential consort could become the future emperor. A mother of an heir could gain enormous power. This created intense competition within the palace. Among Emperor Wu's most famous consorts was Empress Wei Zifu. She came from a humble background, but rose to become one of the most influential women in the empire. Her son, Liu Ju, became crown prince. For many years, the future seemed secure. The heir had been chosen. The imperial family appeared stable, but palace politics rarely remained peaceful for long. As Emperor Wu grew older, new factions emerged. Powerful officials gained influence. Rival consorts competed for attention. Rumors of supernatural threats and political conspiracies spread throughout the court. Eventually, the crown prince became caught in a terrifying accusation. The accusation involved witchcraft. In ancient China, claims of sorcery were not merely personal attacks. They could become political weapons. A person accused of using magical methods to harm the emperor could be treated as a traitor. According to historical records, a series of events known as the witchcraft disaster unfolded during the later years of Emperor Wu's reign. Officials claimed that enemies within the palace had used forbidden practices against the emperor. The investigation expanded. More people became involved. Fear spread. Eventually, suspicion reached Crown Prince Liu Ju, the emperor's own son, the heir to the throne. The young prince found himself accused of participating in a conspiracy against his father. The evidence remains debated by historians. What is clear is that the accusation destroyed the relationship between father and son. A conflict erupted in the capital. The crown prince, fearing arrest and execution, raised forces in self-defense. The situation quickly escalated. What began as an investigation became an armed confrontation between supporters of the emperor and supporters of the heir. The rebellion failed. Liu Ju was forced to flee. Eventually, he died. His mother, Empress Wei, also fell from power. A family that once represented the future of the empire had been destroyed by suspicion. Years later, Emperor Wu reportedly regretted what had happened. A temple was built in memory of his lost son, but regret could not reverse history. The heir was gone. The imperial family was permanently damaged. This tragedy revealed one of the most dangerous aspects of ancient monarchy. When the ruler's trust disappeared, even the closest family member could become an enemy. Centuries later, another Chinese dynasty would experience an even more famous and disturbing example of royal family conflict. The Tang dynasty. The Tang era is often remembered as one of China's greatest periods. Its capital, Chang'an, became one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Poetry flourished, trade expanded, foreign cultures entered China through the Silk Road. The empire appeared powerful and sophisticated, yet inside the imperial palace, one woman would rise to unprecedented authority. Her name was Wu Zetian. She remains one of the most controversial figures in Chinese history. She was the only woman ever to officially rule China as emperor in her own name. Before reaching that position, however, she navigated one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. The imperial court. Wu Zetian entered the palace as a young woman during the reign of Emperor Taizong of Tang. After Taizong's death, she became associated with his son, Emperor Gaozong. This alone was controversial because women from a previous emperor's household were traditionally expected to leave court life after his death. Instead, Wu returned to influence. Over time, she became Gaozong's empress. Her intelligence, political ability, and determination allowed her to overcome powerful rivals, but her rise created enemies. Ancient historians accused her of eliminating opponents through manipulation and even murder. Some stories claimed she sacrificed members of her own family to secure power. Others portrayed her as ruthless beyond measure. Modern historians continue debating which accusations are reliable and which were shaped by later opposition to a female ruler, because traditional Chinese political culture strongly favored male leadership. Many historians believe Wu Zetian faced unusual hostility simply because she broke a fundamental expectation. Yet one fact remains undeniable. She was extraordinarily successful. She managed government effectively. She promoted talented officials. She expanded the empire. She strengthened the examination system that later became central to Chinese bureaucracy. Her reign was not simply a story of cruelty. It was also a story of remarkable political skill. But power always demanded a price. Wu's own family became part of the struggle. Her sons were repeatedly placed in positions of importance, then removed when she believed they threatened her authority. The question of succession followed her constantly. Who would inherit the empire? Would it pass through her own bloodline? Or would the traditional Tang family return? Every choice created enemies. Every possible heir represented a different future. Eventually, Wu Zetian was forced to surrender power. The Tang dynasty was restored. Her name remained controversial for centuries. Some remembered her as a brilliant ruler. Others remembered her as a dangerous woman who violated tradition. The debate itself reveals something important. Royal families often become battlegrounds, not only over power, but over memory. The winners write official histories. The losers become villains. The truth often lies somewhere between. But perhaps no Chinese dynasty demonstrated the terrifying consequences of family succession more dramatically than the later Ming dynasty. The Ming emperors ruled from the Forbidden City, a palace complex so enormous that it seemed almost like a separate world. Behind its massive walls, thousands of servants lived according to strict rules. The emperor stood at the center of everything. His word was law. His decisions affected millions. Yet even inside the Forbidden City, the emperor could not escape the danger created by his own relatives. The most famous example came during the reign of Emperor Yongle. His path to the throne was not peaceful. He was not the original heir. His nephew, the Jianwen Emperor, inherited the throne after the death of their shared father, the Hongwu Emperor. But Yongle believed the young emperor's advisors were weakening the empire, or at least that was the justification he gave. In reality, he wanted power. He launched a rebellion against his own nephew, a prince against an emperor, an uncle against his brother's son. The conflict became known as the Jingnan Campaign. After years of fighting, Yongle captured the capital. The Jianwen Emperor disappeared. What happened to him remains one of China's greatest historical mysteries. Some believed he died in the palace fire. Others claimed he escaped and lived secretly as a monk. The uncertainty only increased the drama. Yongle became emperor, but his victory carried a disturbing message. In imperial China, even the closest relatives could become enemies when the throne was involved. The dragon throne had no room for equal claimants. Only one person could sit upon it, and throughout Chinese history, countless members of royal families would discover that approaching the throne too closely could be far more dangerous than remaining far away. Because in the world of absolute monarchy, family was not always a source of protection. Sometimes it was the greatest threat of all. And as we continue our journey through history's most disturbing royal families, we will enter another palace where ambition, betrayal, and fear transformed a powerful dynasty into a place where brothers fought brothers and rulers turned against their own children. The next chapter would take us to the Ottoman Empire, where succession was so dangerous that princes learned from childhood that their closest relatives might one day become their greatest enemies. The Ottoman Empire created one of history's most powerful and long-lasting royal systems. For more than 6 centuries, Ottoman sultans ruled vast territories across 3 continents, controlling lands in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Their armies reached the gates of Vienna. Their fleets dominated important seas. Their capital, Constantinople became one of the most magnificent cities on earth. From outside, the Ottoman dynasty appeared disciplined, wealthy, and almost unstoppable. Inside the imperial family, however, existed one of the most frightening succession systems ever created. The Ottoman rulers faced a problem that haunted almost every absolute monarchy. What happens when a powerful ruler dies and multiple sons have a legitimate claim? In many European kingdoms, traditions of inheritance eventually created clearer rules. The eldest son usually inherited the throne. The Ottoman Empire followed a very different path. For much of its history, there was no strict rule that the oldest son automatically became sultan. Any son of the previous ruler could potentially fight for power. A prince was not simply a child waiting for his father's throne. He was a future possibility, a future danger, and every prince knew that the greatest obstacle between him and the throne might be his own brothers. This reality shaped the lives of Ottoman princes from childhood. They were raised in luxury, but surrounded by uncertainty. They received education in politics, military leadership, and administration. They were taught how to rule, but they were also taught something darker: survival. A prince who failed to secure power after his father's death could lose everything: his freedom, his position, sometimes his life. The palace that protected him could quickly become a prison. The origins of this brutal succession tradition developed during the empire's early centuries. The Ottoman founders built their state through military strength, political alliances, and family competition. Unlike later monarchies that emphasized orderly inheritance, early Ottoman rulers often accepted conflict among princes as a natural part of political life. The logic was harsh. A civil war between brothers was considered preferable to a divided empire. The empire had witnessed situations where multiple sons claimed authority, and competing factions supported different princes. Such struggles could last for years. Cities could be destroyed. Armies could split. Thousands could die. Eventually, Ottoman rulers concluded that eliminating rival claimants might prevent larger conflicts. The most infamous expression of this idea came during the reign of Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. Mehmed II transformed the Ottoman Empire into a global power. In 1453, he captured Constantinople from the Byzantine Empire, ending more than 1,000 years of Byzantine rule and establishing the city as the Ottoman capital. He was a brilliant military strategist, an administrator, and a ruler determined to create a centralized empire. But Mehmed also understood the danger of succession. After gaining the throne, he supported a principle that shocked many observers. A new sultan could execute his brothers to secure the stability of the empire. This practice became known as fratricide. The idea was not based on personal hatred, It was based on political calculation. A living brother represented a possible rebellion. A dead brother represented a reduced threat. From a modern perspective, the practice appears horrifying, even within the historical context of the Ottoman Empire. It reflected the extreme measures rulers believed were necessary to prevent civil war. The most famous example occurred after maimed Ai's death. His son Bayezid II and another son, Sem Sultan, competed for the throne. Sem was not immediately killed. Instead, he became one of the most famous examples of what happened to defeated Ottoman princes. After losing the struggle, Sem fled and sought support from foreign powers. His existence became a political weapon. European rulers realized that possessing an Ottoman prince gave them leverage against the Sultan. Sem spent years moving between courts, never fully free, never fully powerless. He became a prisoner of his own royal blood. His story demonstrated a terrifying reality. Being a prince of the Ottoman Empire was not always a privilege. Sometimes it was a lifelong danger. The fear of succession shaped family relationships. Brothers could not simply love one another. They had to consider possibilities. A brother today could become a rival tomorrow. A childhood companion could become a political threat after their father died. This atmosphere created a palace where trust was extremely fragile. One of the most dramatic examples came during the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman ruled during the Ottoman Empire's golden age. His armies expanded across Europe and the Middle East. His court became famous for architecture, literature, and culture. Yet beneath this magnificent image existed a painful family tragedy involving his own children. Suleiman had several sons who were potential heirs. Among them, Prince Mustafa became especially popular. Mustafa was intelligent, experienced, and respected by soldiers. Many members of the Ottoman military believed he possessed the qualities needed to become the next sultan. But popularity was dangerous. A prince loved by the army could become a threat to the reigning ruler. Suleiman's relationship with Mustafa became increasingly complicated. The situation was influenced by palace factions, especially those surrounding Suleiman's wife, Hurrem Sultan. Hurrem was one of the most influential women in Ottoman history. She began life as a slave, but rose to become Suleiman's legal wife and a powerful political figure. Her influence at court was extraordinary. She had sons of her own, and like every mother of a royal prince, she had reasons to worry about the future. If Mustafa became sultan, what would happen to Hurrem's sons? The Ottoman succession system provided a terrifying answer. Rival princes were rarely allowed to live peacefully. After one brother gained power, the survival of one son could mean the destruction of another. This reality created intense competition among mothers and their children. Palace politics became a struggle for survival. In 1553, during a military campaign against Persia, Prince Mustafa was summoned to his father's tent. He entered believing he was meeting the Sultan. Instead, he was killed. The exact circumstances remain debated. Some historians emphasize Hurrem and her ally Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha's influence. Others argue Suleiman himself made the decision because he feared military rebellion. Whatever the motivation, the result shocked the Ottoman world. Mustafa was immensely popular. His death caused grief among soldiers and ordinary people. A beloved prince had been removed, not because he had lost a battle, but because his potential power had become dangerous. The tragedy revealed the cruel mathematics of Ottoman succession. A prince did not need to commit treason. He did not need to rebel. Sometimes being too respected was enough. Suleiman's remaining sons continued their own rivalry. Eventually, Selim II became sultan. The empire survived, but the family wounds remained. Over time, the Ottoman system evolved. The practice of executing brothers gradually declined. Instead, later sultans often confined potential heirs inside a special section of the palace called the caves, or the cage. The name itself reveals the reality. Princes lived in isolation. They had luxury. They had servants. They had everything except freedom. They waited behind palace walls, uncertain whether they would ever rule. Some spent decades in confinement. They watched years pass without meaningful contact with the outside world. When one prince finally became sultan after the death of his relative, he sometimes inherited the throne without the experience needed to govern. The system had prevented civil wars, but it created another problem. Rulers who had spent their lives isolated from society suddenly controlled a massive empire. The psychological consequences could be severe. Some historians argue that the isolation contributed to instability among certain later Ottoman rulers. The very system designed to protect the dynasty sometimes weakened it. The Ottoman family story reveals a disturbing paradox. The dynasty survived for centuries partly because it accepted extreme solutions to succession. But those solutions came at an enormous human cost. Fathers feared sons. Brothers feared brothers. Mothers fought political battles for their children's survival. Princes grew up knowing that love and danger could come from the same person. The Ottoman palace was filled with gold, marble, music, and ceremony. Yet beneath the beauty existed a constant question: who would survive long enough to wear the Sultan's crown, and who would disappear before ever reaching it? As centuries passed, another royal family would develop an even more unusual and unsettling system of succession. They would not solve their problems through brotherly warfare. Instead, they would isolate themselves through strict traditions, complicated marriages, and a relentless pursuit of preserving royal blood. Their story would come from the royal courts of Europe, where one famous dynasty became trapped by its own obsession with purity and inheritance. The royal courts of Europe often presented themselves as symbols of elegance, tradition, and stability. Grand palaces stood as monuments to power. Kings and queens appeared in portraits wearing jeweled crowns and magnificent clothing. Their marriages were celebrated as alliances between nations. Their children represented the future of entire kingdoms. Yet behind the polished image of European royalty existed a problem that slowly damaged one of the continent's most powerful families: the desire to preserve royal blood. For centuries, European monarchs believed that noble ancestry was something precious that needed protection. Marriages between royal families were rarely based on personal affection. They were political agreements designed to strengthen alliances, secure territories, and maintain claims to thrones. But when the same families repeatedly married among themselves, a dangerous pattern developed. The royal bloodline became narrower with each generation. One of the most famous examples was the Habsburg dynasty. For hundreds of years, the Habsburgs stood among the most powerful rulers in Europe. They controlled vast territories, including Austria, Spain, parts of Central Europe, and enormous overseas possessions. At the height of their power, their influence seemed almost impossible to challenge. A common saying described their success: "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." The phrase reflected the dynasty's extraordinary use of marriage diplomacy. While other rulers gained territory through armies, the Habsburgs often expanded through carefully arranged marriages. A wedding could bring them kingdoms. A child could unite claims across continents. A family connection could achieve what thousands of soldiers could not. But this strategy carried a hidden cost. The Habsburgs became one of the most famous examples in history of the dangers of repeated close relative marriages. The problem developed slowly. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. Royal families across Europe already married relatives because the pool of acceptable partners was limited. A princess could not simply marry anyone. A prince needed someone with appropriate status. Religious and political considerations narrowed choices even further. Over generations, however, the Habsburg family tree became increasingly interconnected. Uncles married nieces. Cousins married cousins. Branches of the same family repeatedly joined together. The goal was preservation. The result was genetic isolation. The most famous victim of this pattern was King Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, Charles inherited one of the largest empires in the world. Spain controlled territories across Europe and the Americas. Its wealth was enormous. Its history was prestigious. But the young king entered the world carrying the consequences of generations of close family marriages. From childhood, Charles appeared physically fragile. Ancient descriptions and later portraits show a ruler with distinctive Habsburg features, including a pronounced lower jaw often associated with the dynasty. Modern genetic studies have suggested that Charles suffered from significant health problems related to inbreeding. He experienced developmental difficulties. He had serious illnesses throughout his life. He was physically weak and unable to produce an heir. For a king, this was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a political disaster. The entire future of the Spanish monarchy depended on one question: could Charles II produce a child? The answer was no, and without a direct heir, Europe prepared for conflict. Charles' life became surrounded by medical treatments, prayers, and desperate attempts to secure succession. Doctors examined him. Religious figures performed rituals. Foreign powers watched closely. Everyone understood the same reality. When Charles died, the Spanish throne would become the center of an international struggle. The king himself seemed aware of his fragile situation. He married twice, but neither marriage produced children. Rumors spread about curses and supernatural causes. Some blamed enemies, others blamed witchcraft. The deeper truth was far more ordinary and tragic. A dynasty had spent centuries protecting its bloodline so carefully that it weakened the very family it wanted to preserve. In 1700, Charles II died at the age of 39. His death ended the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty, but it did not end the conflict. Instead, it triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, one of Europe's major international conflicts. Several powerful nations fought over who should inherit Spain's enormous empire. A family decision made generations earlier had now become a global political crisis. The Habsburg story was not only about genetics, it was about the dangers of obsession. The dynasty believed that royal blood gave them legitimacy. They feared losing control of their inheritance. They feared outsiders gaining influence, so they repeatedly looked inward. Eventually, the family became trapped inside the very system they created. But Charles II was not the only European ruler whose family life became a source of tragedy. Another famous dynasty, the Romanovs of Russia, would experience a different kind of disaster. Unlike the Habsburgs, their greatest threat was not caused by centuries of marriage patterns. Their tragedy came from secrecy, political isolation, and a royal family unable to understand how dramatically the world around them was changing. The Romanovs ruled Russia for more than 300 years. Their empire stretched across 11 time zones. Their palaces represented unimaginable wealth. Their armies were among the largest on earth. Yet by the beginning of the 20th century, the family at the center of this enormous empire had become increasingly disconnected from the people they ruled. The last Romanov emperor, Nicholas II, came to power in 1894. Many observers described him as polite, gentle, and devoted to his family. Unlike some powerful rulers, Nicholas did not appear naturally aggressive or hungry for conquest. He loved his wife, Alexandra, and their children deeply. In private, he valued family life more than politics. But being Emperor of Russia required something very different. It required decisive leadership. The Russian Empire was facing enormous challenges. Industrialization was changing society. Workers demanded better conditions. Political movements questioned absolute monarchy. Revolutionary ideas spread. Millions of ordinary Russians struggled with poverty, while the royal family lived surrounded by luxury. The gap between palace life and everyday reality continued growing. Nicholas believed strongly in maintaining the traditional authority of the monarchy. He viewed reforms cautiously. He feared that giving too much power to political groups would weaken Russia. From his perspective, he was protecting stability. From the perspective of many critics, he was refusing to recognize reality. The most painful challenge for Nicholas and Alexandra was personal. They had 4 daughters: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Then, in 1904, their long-awaited son was born. Alexei, the birth of a male heir, should have been the greatest moment of celebration for the Romanov family. Instead, it brought a devastating secret. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a condition that prevented his blood from clotting normally. Even a minor injury could become life-threatening. For a royal family whose future depended on the survival of one child, this was terrifying. Nicholas and Alexandra became extremely protective of their son. They searched desperately for treatments. Their desperation opened the door for one of the most controversial figures in Russian history, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian mystic who gained influence because Alexandra believed he could help Alexei during dangerous medical episodes. His ability to calm the boy's suffering created deep trust within the royal household. But his presence at court became a political disaster. Many Russians believed Rasputin controlled the empress. Rumors spread about corruption, inappropriate relationships, and secret influence over government decisions. Some accusations were exaggerated. Some were based on genuine concerns. But the damage was enormous. The monarchy's reputation suffered. People began viewing the royal family as isolated and manipulated. The tragedy of the Romanovs was not created by one person. It was the result of many failures combined: a changing society, a rigid political system, a devastating war, a ruler unable to adapt quickly enough, and a family whose private struggles became public symbols of national weakness. By 1917, revolution reached Russia. The Romanovs lost power. Nicholas abdicated. The family was placed under guard. The once powerful imperial household became prisoners in their own country. They waited, hoping that political circumstances would eventually allow them to leave. They never received that chance. In July 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and several servants were executed by Bolshevik forces in Yekaterinburg. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for more than 3 centuries, ended in a single night. The fall of the Romanovs revealed another terrifying truth about royal families. A dynasty can appear immortal until the moment it suddenly is not. Palaces can become prisons, crowns can become burdens, and families that seem protected by history can discover that history itself can turn against them. Yet the Romanovs were not the only European royals whose private tragedies became national disasters. Across the continent, another famous dynasty faced scandals involving marriages, succession struggles, and the dangerous consequences of royal isolation. A family that would eventually rule one of the most famous monarchies in the modern world would also experience betrayal, unexpected deaths, and personal conflicts hidden behind palace walls. The story of disturbing royal families does not end with fallen emperors, vanished princes, or destroyed dynasties of the ancient world. Even in the modern age, royal households continued to face the same timeless struggles that had haunted kings and queens for thousands of years. Power, inheritance, reputation, and the impossible challenge of remaining human while carrying a crown. One of the most influential royal families of modern history was the British royal family, whose story was shaped not only by political decisions, but also by personal relationships, expectations, and the enormous pressure created by public attention. Unlike many earlier dynasties, the British monarchy gradually transformed into a constitutional institution where rulers no longer possessed unlimited power. The king or queen became a symbol of national identity rather than an absolute ruler. Yet the emotional pressures inside the royal household remained. The monarchy still depended on succession. It still depended on carefully managed public images, and it still placed extraordinary expectations on individuals born into a life they never chose. The House of Windsor, as it became known in the 20th century, faced challenges that were very different from those of ancient emperors. They were not usually defeated by armies. They were not overthrown by rival princes. Instead, they faced something new: the relentless observation of modern society. Every marriage, every disagreement, every personal struggle, every private moment could become a public event. Perhaps one of the most dramatic examples came through King Edward VII. When Edward became king in 1936, many people expected him to represent a modern and energetic monarchy. He was popular with many members of the public. He appeared confident and independent, but his personal life soon created a constitutional crisis. Edward had fallen in love with Wally Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced. At the time, the situation was considered unacceptable for a British monarch, who was also the head of the Church of England. The government warned that a marriage between the king and Simpson would create serious political problems. Edward faced an impossible choice: the crown or the woman he loved. After months of pressure, he made his decision. He abdicated the throne. His younger brother, Albert, became King George VI. The event shocked the world. A monarch had voluntarily surrendered one of the most powerful positions on earth because of a personal relationship. The abdication demonstrated something unusual about modern royalty. The crown was no longer simply taken through conquest or inherited without question. A ruler could be forced to consider public opinion, political responsibility, and personal happiness. George VI never expected to become king. He had lived most of his life away from the direct path to the throne. He suffered from a severe stammer and was naturally reserved. Yet, after his brother's abdication, he accepted the responsibility. During the Second World War, he became a symbol of courage and stability for Britain. His wife, Elizabeth, also played an important role in supporting the monarchy. Together, they helped restore public confidence after the crisis. Their daughter, Princess Elizabeth, eventually became Queen Elizabeth II. For many decades, she represented continuity and tradition. Her reign became one of the longest in British history. However, even during periods of stability, the royal family continued facing challenges caused by the same forces that had troubled monarchies for centuries: family expectations, public pressure, conflicts between personal desires and official duties. The most famous modern royal crisis involved Prince Charles and Princess Diana. Their marriage was celebrated around the world. Millions watched their wedding in 1981. Diana quickly became one of the most admired public figures on the planet. Her compassion, charity work, and ability to connect with ordinary people made her enormously popular. But behind the public image, the marriage experienced serious difficulties. The relationship between Charles and Diana became increasingly strained. The pressures of royal life, media attention, and personal disagreements eventually led to separation and divorce. The situation created one of the biggest challenges the modern monarchy had faced. The public saw not only a royal couple struggling privately, but also a famous institution forced to confront uncomfortable realities. Diana's tragic death in 1997 intensified these debates. Millions mourned her. Questions were raised about the relationship between royalty, the media, and public expectations. The monarchy survived, but the event changed how many people viewed royal families. The image of perfect royal life became harder to maintain. The lesson repeated throughout history: a palace can hide many things, but it cannot hide everything forever. From ancient Persia to imperial Rome, from Ottoman courts to European castles, royal families often struggled with the same fundamental problem. They were expected to represent perfection, while living ordinary human experiences behind extraordinary walls. They experienced love. They experienced jealousy. They experienced fear. They experienced ambition. The crown did not remove human emotions. It amplified them. Across history, some royal families collapsed because they fought too openly. Others collapsed because they hid too much. Some destroyed themselves through ambition. Others weakened themselves through isolation. The Macedonians lost their empire because succession became a battlefield. The Julio-Claudians destroyed themselves through suspicion and betrayal. The Persian kings struggled with rival heirs. Chinese imperial families experienced endless conflicts over the dragon throne. Ottoman princes lived knowing their brothers could become executioners. The Habsburgs weakened their own bloodline through generations of carefully controlled marriages. The Romanovs lost their throne because they failed to adapt to a changing world. Each story was different, yet the pattern remained remarkably similar. Absolute power changes relationships. When one person controls everything, everyone around them becomes connected to that power. A son is no longer only a son. He may also be an heir. A brother is no longer only a brother. He may also be a rival. A spouse is no longer only a partner. They may also represent a political alliance. A family dinner can become a negotiation. A marriage can become a strategy. A childhood friendship can become a future threat. This was the hidden burden of royal life. The same blood that created a dynasty could also destroy it. The same palace that protected a family could become a place of fear. The same crown that represented greatness could become a source of endless danger. History often remembers kings and queens through their victories, their battles, their monuments, their achievements. But behind every crown was a person surrounded by expectations, a person making decisions under unimaginable pressure, a person trying to survive in a world where trust was never simple. The most disturbing royal families in history were not disturbing because they were different from humanity. They were disturbing because they revealed humanity at its most intense. Ambition, love, fear, pride, desperation, all of these emotions existed inside the greatest palaces ever built. The walls were covered in gold. The floors were made of marble. The halls echoed with music and ceremony. But behind closed doors, royal families faced the same struggles that have followed human beings throughout history. The struggle for security, the struggle for recognition, the struggle for power, and sometimes the struggle simply to survive. The story of these dynasties reminds us that no empire is truly permanent. No throne is completely secure, and no family, no matter how wealthy or powerful, can escape the consequences of its own choices. The crowns may disappear, the palaces may become museums, the names may become legends, but the human stories remain. And perhaps that is why these royal families continue to fascinate us centuries later. Because beneath the jewels, the armies, and the magnificent ceremonies, they were still families. Families who loved, families who feared, families who fought, families who changed the course of history. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.